Hi, good evening, everybody, and welcome to our interview this evening. And we're going to be speaking tonight about design in God's world. And I have with me a very special guest all the way from the UK, Professor Stuart Burgess, who's Professor of Design and Engineering at Bristol University. So we're going to be discussing the issue of design in God's world in a moment. But first of all, before that, I just want to tell you about a few things that are coming up. In October, we have an online mega conference taking place, October 28th to the 30th of October. That'll be a 3-day online conference live on Answers TV. And so there'll be a link to that in the comment section below. And I would encourage you to sign up for that. There's going to be 3 days of amazing talks from amazing speakers from all around the world. I'll be participating in that, as will Professor Stuart Burgess. And just so you know, I'll be speaking on the subject of scoffers. And I had this arrive today all the way from the US. This is my new book that has just come out, Scoffers, Responding to Those Who Deliberately Overlook Creation and the Flood. And so it's an exposition and application of 2 Peter chapter 3. And so there's going to be a link to that in the comment section below. And so I would encourage you to get your hands on that book. And another book that I'm going to recommend, and I had to dig this book out of my son's bed just about half an hour ago because he's been reading it, and it's it's by Stuart Burgess and Professor Andy McIntosh, Wonders of Creation, Design in a Fallen World. If you have not yet got this book, then you need to get your hands on this book as soon as you can. This is an amazing book that deals with different aspects of design in God's creation. It's a great book also to give away to people maybe who need to consider this issue. So again, there'll be a link to this in the comment section below, but I encourage you to get your hands on those resources. But without any further ado, I'm going to welcome my guest this evening. Welcome, Stuart, to our interview tonight.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So, Stuart, for those that don't know, you've actually won several national and international awards for engineering and design. So can you tell us some of the things that you've designed and won awards for?
Yeah, I've worked in a few different areas. I've worked for the European Space Agency, mainly on Earth observation satellites, also some rockets, the Skylark rocket. I even worked a little bit on the Hubble Space Telescope. I've also designed parts of atomic force microscopes, mainly the positioning stage. That's the mechanism that holds the sample for the microscope. Been working on that mainly in the last 10 years. But I've also, probably the most enjoyable work has been working for Team GB Racing bicycles. I led the design of the transmission for the Rio and also the Tokyo Olympics that have just taken place. And I'm happy to say in Tokyo, Team GB came first again for the cycling. And of course, that was more to do with the chain than the cyclist. That's the real secret to winning the gold medals. But it's been a great privilege to work at the forefront of engineering technology, to work with fantastic designers around the world. Really exciting to be at that forefront of technology.
Yeah, and I just saw a comment from someone there from Australia. And of course, if anyone watched the Olympics at the velodrome with the cycling, they'll know that actually one of the Australian bikes collapsed in literally as the cyclist was going around the track. And why did that happen, Stuart?
It's because when you're designing an optimal thing like an Olympic racing bicycle, you have to go to extremes of design, and you get the lightest component possible. But if you do that, if it's just slightly overloaded, it might break. And every designer knows the feeling of worrying that their part's going to break. When I saw that live on the television, I really felt sorry for the designer of that part. But when you design, you do get nervous. You realize that things can go wrong. Design doesn't happen by chance. It's a difficult thing.
Yeah, which leads us to the question, Stuart. How difficult then is it to design things? Anything? Is it easy, or is there a procedure in it?
Well, it can seem easy. You look at a car and on the outside, it all looks pretty compact. But if you really look under the bonnet, look inside the engine, you realize design is actually very complicated. To design a complex technical system like, say, a spacecraft or a microscope, it takes years of planning and years of testing to get all the subsystems finely tuned and optimized. Every designer knows that those things have to be carefully planned. Interestingly, I've been designing now for nearly 40 years. And when I speak to other designers, even those without a religious agenda, they say to me they cannot see how people can believe in the theory of evolution, because design needs such planning and such care and such precision. But I also find that the proponents of evolution, who've usually never designed anything, seem to have a poor understanding of why a complex system actually needs design.
So just as an example, what would you say is the most difficult thing that you've ever had to design?
The most difficult thing I had to design was a deployment gearbox for a spacecraft solar array. The difficulty was there was a very small amount of space for the mechanism to fit. There wasn't anything in the whole world. I had to design a gearbox from scratch, something that had never been designed before. I couldn't apply a theory of evolution and just adapt another gearbox. I couldn't evolve anything. I had to create something completely unique. And I invented what's called a double action worm gear set, a completely unique gear set. There's a world patent on it. It won a lot of national prizes. When I first designed it, I presented it at Oxford University, and an Oxford professor said, that can't work. No one's ever done that before. It was so different, but it did work, and it was very successful, and it's still used on European satellites. It was used for 20 years on European satellites. But that's an example of how in design, sometimes you have to design something completely unique. And it's hard to say how I came up with this double action worm gear set. If you invent something that has never existed before, it's really hard to explain how you do that. We have this phrase amongst engineers that scientists describe what is, engineers create what has never been. So engineering is a harder profession than science. But again, that also is relevant for the natural world. Something must have invented the great things that we see in creation, and that inventor is God.
Yeah, which leads us to our next question, Stuart, because the Bible tells us, the Apostle Paul tells us in Romans 1:20, that God's attributes and his nature have been portrayed through creation ever since the creation of the world. Romans 1:20 tells us. So, that tells us that God's nature is there in creation, that we can recognize creation. But how do you recognize design? What tips could you give to people to say this is how you recognize that something is designed?
Yeah, I think anyone who's honest, looking at the beauty of creation, looking at the complexity of the natural world, anyone who's honest has to say there must be a designer. Every day, we're all putting order into the world, tidying things up. We know that order comes about by some intelligent means, but you can actually describe it in a more technical way. I've written a book, Hallmarks of Design, and I have particular hallmarks of a designer. One of them is irreducible complexity, which is quite well known amongst creationists. What it means is there are certain systems that can't come about step by step. You see that in an engineering system. If you're designing a spacecraft, you can't just add one component at a time. All the components have to be there together for the whole system to work. But that's also true of biological systems. I've done a lot of research on the human knee joint, producing bioinspired robotic joints. I've published a lot of papers that show that it's an irreducible system. You need a lot of different parts, the bones, the ligaments, the muscles. If they're not all there in place, then the system won't work. And so what that means is you can't evolve a knee joint from another kind of joint, like the elbow joint. And if you look at the fossil record, there's no evidence of anything intermediate. And it's that kind of irreducible complexity that gives very powerful evidence of design. But I would emphasize that the basic beauty and complexity of creation is an evidence to everyone.
Yeah. Just to remind everyone who's watching, if you have a question on design and you want to ask Professor Burgess that, we'll try and get to that maybe towards the end of the program. And it's great to see people watching from Switzerland, from Montevideo in Uruguay, from Denver. And someone's even mentioned the fact that they just received Wonders of Creation for their birthday and they're reading it. So that's really good. A great encouragement that book is to many people. So if you haven't got it yet, a reminder to get that book. But Stuart, what would you say? What is a powerful design, an example of design in the natural world? What is the most powerful for you of something that's designed in the natural world?
Well, there are so many. It's really hard to choose. I've done quite a lot of work on flight, the flight of insects. I think any kind of flight is a very powerful example. But actually, one of my favorite would be the human blood circulation system, because it's an incredible plumbing system. And being a mechanical engineer, I've been involved in plumbing systems before, central heating systems. But the plumbing system in the human blood circulation system is beyond anything that engineers could have done or even could dream of. The heart, it's a double pump. It pumps two separate circuits in the body. There's a low pressure circuit, ideal for the lungs, and a high pressure circuit, ideal for the body, getting blood right to the end of the legs and back. For the heart to be able to be a double pump, it has these 4 chambers. It's really remarkable. And when you think that the heart pumps over 7,000 liters of blood a day in an adult, and it can do that for up to 100 years or more, it's really quite astounding. Engineers can only dream of producing a system or a pump that could do that. Interestingly, the organs of the body are plumbed in parallel. What that means is you don't have blood just going to, say, the stomach or the bladder and then going on. It actually bypasses, and there's a separate parallel circuit to them. That keeps the pressure of the whole system up. So it's a very complex system. And if you speak to an engineer about building a central heating system, you can't do that step by step. Everything has to be in place. Otherwise, you've got leaks and chaos. Especially with plumbing, everything has to be sealed, tested. It's got to be all ready to go. And so it is with the blood circulation system. And just to add one other astounding statistic, if you add up the length of all the blood vessels in the body, it comes to something like 100,000 miles of blood vessels, which is just mind-boggling and something that engineers could just not replicate.
Yeah, we can't even comprehend that. That's an amazing fact. And as you said, that could never have evolved step by step. But Stuart, as an engineer, I know engineers all the time are trying to improve man-made products by copying, design that they see in nature. But could you give us some examples of this, and how does this point to the living world having been designed by God?
Yeah, this is an area of growing importance at the moment. Bioinspired design or biomimetics. One of the most famous examples comes from the Wright brothers, the famous Americans. Just over 100 years ago, they designed the first aeroplane. I think it was called Kitty Hawk. And one of the keys to their success was that they studied bird flight. They studied birds like pigeons. The reason they studied birds was because all of the engineers at the time were having trouble controlling these aircraft. Every time they went to do a turn, the plane would crash, and no one knew how to get the right control flaps, the right control. And the Wright brothers were the first to solve it, and they solved it by studying birds. And what they noticed with pigeons is that when the pigeons did a turn, their tail feathers would twist in the opposite direction to compensate for what was the differential drag on the wings. And once they'd learned that from the birds, they then put on similar control flaps onto the aircraft, and they were very surprised. It worked very quickly, and they became very, very famous. But that's just one example. Other examples include Velcro, which came from the burr plant, and Velcro has been extremely successful. Also, self-cleaning glass inspired by the lotus plant. I've done bioinspired design myself for the knee joint, I mentioned that, but also I've studied dragonflies and produced bioinspired micro air vehicles. So it's a really broad and successful area that there are journals that record lots of examples. But bioinspired design, I believe, provides very strong evidence for intelligent design, because if evolution were true, nature would be less sophisticated than human engineering, because evolution is restricted to step-by-step change. When I'm teaching my students, I tell them I expect very innovative designs because they're not restricted to step-by-step change. But what we actually find in the natural world is that nature is superior to human engineering. That's exactly what you would expect by biblical creation, but not by evolution. So I think bioinspiration is a really exciting area that's a great friend and support of biblical creation.
Yeah, and there's some great work being done in that area. Now I can see a comment has come up by obviously someone who maybe doesn't agree, and he's asked a question or made a statement. And I know you've answered this question probably 1,000 times, Stuart. It's the question of the human eye. John has stated, what about the human eye? If it was designed, it's a half-fake job. And I know Richard Dawkins brings that up a lot. He brings that argument up. So what about it, Stuart? Is the human eye half-baked? Is it a bad job?
The first thing I would say with that is I have spoken with medical experts, biologists, who have told me that they are in absolute awe of the brilliance of the design of the eye. If you speak to a camera designer, they would say engineers cannot get anywhere near the size of an eye. If you're producing a camera that can do the things that an eye can do, if you study the iris, it has many dozens, if not hundreds, of tiny muscles, two antagonistic sets of muscles that can open and close the pupil with precision, very fast. It is the most staggeringly brilliant design. It also works. And when Richard Dawkins says the eye is a bad design, he doesn't explain, that it doesn't work particularly well. The human eye has incredible resolution and works extremely well. As for it being a bad design, Dawkins has claimed that it's wired backwards, because as light goes through the eye, it has to travel through the retina to get to the back of the retina, to the light sensitive cells. Now that is a very blatant mistake, because Dawkins is unaware of the fact that scientists have discovered what are called Muller cells, which are effectively fiber optic cables that guide the light through the retina. The light doesn't degrade as it goes through the retina. It actually goes through fiber optic cables. And not only does it not degrade, but those fiber optic cables incredibly do signal conditioning on that light signal. They even cut out reflected light. I think they do other things. And engineers are so in awe of that design. They would like to copy that. So the problem with the eye is not a bad design in the eye. What the problem is Dawkins' lack of understanding of how the eye actually works and what research has been carried out.
That leads to I guess to another question, Stuart, that I can see someone has stated. Just because the eye is cool doesn't mean it doesn't have huge problems. So, if we're saying the eye is designed, if there are problems with it, what does that mean? How do we account for those problems, and why do those problems occur?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. If I go back 20 years, I wasn't wearing glasses. But now, in fact, now I have to wear 2 pairs of glasses for long sight and short sight. It's a good question, because the Bible explains that the creation now is not how God created it originally. When God created things originally, there was no death, no disease, no growing old. Adam and Eve would never have needed glasses, even after 1,000 years. They wouldn't have had arthritis and other things, but because of the rebellion of Adam and Eve, God carried out his judgment of a curse on creation. That's had a huge effect. So when I talk about very good design, I'm leaving aside growing old, death, and disease. I'm talking about the concept of design. But sadly, we get old, things go wrong. There are also some horrible diseases, and the eye you can obviously you can go blind and have other diseases. But the basic design itself is a very good design. And when the Bible says we're fearfully and wonderfully made, I believe modern science has shown that to be true.
Yeah. I mean, just because there's bad design in certain things, or what we perceive as bad design, often people try and use that to say, well, it couldn't have been created. But that's a bad argument, isn't it? Because just because something's badly or doesn't work properly, it doesn't mean it is not designed.
Yeah, and William Paley, the famous author wrote in 1802 Natural Theology, and he said if you found a Swiss watch, and it broke down one day, you wouldn't then say, I now conclude it wasn't designed. It obviously is still designed. The fact that it broke down doesn't matter.
Yeah. And so obviously we've been talking about Richard Dawkins and atheists, and because atheists will bring up all sorts of objections to biblical creation, to intelligent design. In fact, one of the things they say, intelligent design or creation isn't a scientific concept. It's rather a God of the gaps concept argument, because it relies on faith. Is that a good argument? Is it a fair argument, Stuart?
Yeah, I've often heard that. Sometimes intelligent design is called God of the gaps because supposedly if an intelligent design proponent can't think of an answer, they say, oh, God did it. And, that solves that. Whereas supposedly the evolutionist is looking to science to answer everything. But I would say it is the complete opposite. I would say evolution is God of the gaps. And I have even heard a senior professor in my university who's not a Christian, and he has said to me, I admit evolution is the real God of the gaps. Why did he say that? The reason is this: if you take, for example, the origin of life from a chemical soup, if you say to an evolutionist, how did life come from a chemical soup? The answer will be evolution did it. If you say, okay, but how did evolution do it? They'll say evolution did it. If you say, well, explain to me in detail, and they say, well, I don't know. If you read Richard Dawkins' book, The Greatest Show on Earth, he says, I don't know. I just believe evolution did it. It's complete blind faith. They don't know the answer, so they said evolution did it. And now you could look at the origin of flight, the origin of a lot of things, and now say, well, evolution did it. Natural selection did it. In contrast, what an intelligent design or creationist would say is that if you need an almighty creator to create life from nothing, then you need a creator. That's not God of the gaps. That's the God of necessity. Mm-hmm. And so intelligent design makes far more sense. And it's actually evolution, which is the God of the gaps. And if I could just add one more point, when an evolutionist talks about the bad design argument, they are using a design argument, but in the opposite direction. Now, you can't, on the one hand, say, I think the eye is badly designed, and therefore intelligent design is not true. You can't then say a design argument is not scientific, because they've just used that. It's just that we disagree with the bad design argument, but that shows that they're using a design argument, but just in a different way.
Yeah. And I could see there's a good bit of interaction going on in our comment section, which is great, folks. We love that people are interacting, and I can see people are bringing up a lot of questions. I can see John's brought up another question. We thank you, John, for your questions, even though you're obviously an evolutionist and you don't believe God created. Well, we'd ask you just to pay attention to what's being said, to take it to heart, to really think about it. But John did ask the question, if we're talking about design and God design, what's the meaning of flower? Is there any purpose to a flower, Stuart, in its design?
Yeah, I mean, in my books, I've written a lot about added beauty. The Lord Jesus said that God has clothed the flowers of the field, i.e., Jesus is teaching that God made the flowers deliberately beautiful for our sakes. I really appreciate flowers. My wife appreciates them, especially when I give her flowers. Flowers have an incredible design, not just the smell, but the smoothness of the petals, the shapes, the colors. God has made flowers for his own pleasure to see them. And also for us. Of course, flowers do attract insects for pollination, but flowers are far more beautiful than they need to be. They don't need to be so colorful, so beautiful. And so they only make sense through creation, not through evolution. And if I can just mention, Charles Darwin talked about the abominable problem. Why did Charles Darwin say that? Charles Darwin, if you read his books, he'll say that flowers caused him a lot of heartache and they were an abominable problem because he could not understand how flowers could come about so fast with his looking at the fossil record and so beautiful. Darwin was very honest when he thought flowers were a big problem to the theory of evolution. And I think they are too, because they're so beautiful. I mentioned already one senior professor that I knew who thought evolution is God of the gaps. I would just like to share that, having been in academia for over 30 years at Cambridge, at Bristol, at Liberty in the United States, one of my biggest surprises at how many senior academics, professors are very sympathetic to intelligent design, who can see the immense weaknesses of the theory of evolution, although normally they won't admit that to the press, because if you admit that there is a bit of bullying that goes on. But I'm just talking from my experience. Evolution has many problems, and many academics can see that.
Yeah, and beauty, as you said, would be one of those problems. How they account for the beauty in the natural world, beauty in flowers. And I think one of my favorite examples that you often point out, Stuart, is the peacock feather. The immense beauty that we see in there. We actually, do we see it? Don't we see that there's actually a degradation in the beauty of the peacock flower over time?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, just to mention, John Maynard Smith was a very famous evolutionist. He died a few years ago, and he quoted that to him, the existence of beauty was the biggest problem to the theory of evolution. Why do you get this immense beauty of flowers, of bird feathers, of bird song? In the case of the peacock, there's this photonic crystals or thin film interference. It's precision physical effects that produces optical interference. So in the peacock, it's not pigment colors, but colors produced by very special optical effects. And you get these amazing patterns. You know, there's an incredible degree of precision in the peacock. And you know, some people say that the female peahen can hardly see some of the details of the patterns. If you look at some of the fringes around, for example, the eye pattern of the tail feathers, and if the female cannot even see the patterns, how can they be choosing those patterns? And there's one particular paper that has been analyzing the beauty of the peacock tail feathers over various generations. And what they've shown is that, surprisingly to them, the beauty was degrading. But that's exactly what creationists predict, that we're in a world which is degrading. It's not getting more beautiful. It's losing beauty and health.
Yeah. We're going to go to another question now, Stuart. I know you mentioned this a few moments ago, the fact that you've been in academia for nearly 30 plus years. You work at Bristol, which for people in the US or around the world who don't know is one of the top leading universities here in the UK. Professor Burgess has also been at Cambridge University, and you'll often hear atheists and evolutionists say, well, there's no scientific papers out there that or publications that show intelligent design or show creation. Is that correct? Are there papers that out there that argue for this position?
That's not correct. There are many scientists who believe in intelligent design, who do lots of publications closely related to some of the talks they give on intelligent design. One thing I would say is that when a scientist writes at the end of their paper, well, this supports intelligent design, it gets very quickly airbrushed out. There are lots of examples of that. There was an example in the last year from Asia. I can't remember the journal, but these Chinese authors put, well, this is obviously a great design by God, and they were told off. It had to be deleted, but the paper still got published. I've published around 180 scientific papers on the science of design. Over 30 are on biomechanics, and all my papers on biomechanics, on the knee joint, on the peacock feathers, they very much relate to the things I give in my talk. So when I give talks, I'm talking on subjects that I have been analyzing in my own lab with my own microscope, in my own work. I see evidence for intelligent design through the work of my own hands and things that I work on myself. I'm not speaking second, third, fourth hand. And I can say that in the 30 years I've been working in my lab, doing work, publishing, it has absolutely confirmed my faith. It's shown me that, yeah, this apparent design really is. It is intricate design, and it is tremendous evidence for a creator.
Yeah, so there are publications out there that people have published in secular journals showing intelligent design. So that's incorrect. But I know you've also experienced, Stuart, even when you've published your own books, Christian books, there's been pushback from people saying, well, you need to take your credentials off that book because they don't want that on it. How often does that happen in academia when people try to suppress that information?
Sadly, it happens very often. It's been happening with intelligent design for probably over 20 years. Recently, we have this kind of woke culture where it's happening in lots of other areas, but in the area of creation, it's been happening for a very long time. So if you're an academic, you're told you're not supposed to support intelligent design. You're not supposed to put it on your website, on your books, on other things. If Isaac Newton was here and the great founding scientists who were biblical creationists, they would be amazed that we have this cancel culture, that we have this vetting. Science should be open. People should be allowed to be open with what they're talking about. So when I first produced books promoting intelligent design, there were academics saying, well, you shouldn't put your academic qualifications on there where you work. But I explained to them, but I am a professor of engineering design. I work on biomechanics. It would almost be misleading if the things I'm writing about come directly from my work in my lab. So if I say, if I wrote on my book, this is nothing to do with my professional work, that would be incorrect, because it's everything to do with my work that I do every day in my lab. It's happened to a lot of other people. But yeah, people have tried to do that with me. But generally, I keep that information on the book because it is to do with my work.
Yeah. And for people who are watching, Stuart, how has that helped your career or has it hindered your career?
That's an interesting question. There are probably spiritual dimensions to that answer, because my answer would be that God's sovereignty does play a part in all of this. It is important to honor God. Another thing I would say, and this has been another big surprise in my working in academia, I have been surprised at the number of non-Christian academics who have supported me very strongly, including some very senior people who've been my boss. I think in engineering, it's not so bad. I've had a lot of support within the engineering faculty. Had I been in a biology department, I think things would be very different. I know biologists who've had a very difficult time because the other biologists feel very threatened in that department. So a lot depends on where you are and who the characters are around you. You need a lot of wisdom and patience. But the thing about engineering is an organization like Team GB, their interest is a gold medal and a world record. They're not so interested if you are a slightly controversial person. What they want is a gold medal. So engineers tend to be very pragmatic.
Yeah. Before I'm going to wrap up in a minute with a final question for Stuart. So if anyone who's watching has a question, a desperate question they want to ask about design, and engineering, then do type it in the comment section and we'll try and get to it. But Stuart, we've maybe touched on this a bit already, the fact that often when we see in the media, whether it's the BBC or American news media, they'll often portray, evolution as scientific fact. Religious people have faith. If you believe in creation or intelligent design, that's a faith position. Is that a fair analysis of the situation?
It's not. It's a myth. The creation debate is not science versus faith. The creation debate is one worldview versus another worldview. It's the worldview with God against the worldview without God. It's wrong to label evolution as science. It's wrong to label intelligent design as mere faith. Evolution requires faith. There's not a shred of evidence that life could come from a chemical soup. So you need faith if you want to believe in evolution. It's a worldview. Intelligent design is not a faith position. As I said, the greatest scientists, Isaac Newton, James Clerk Maxwell, Faraday, Fleming, the list is a very long list. They were great scientists. They had a biblical worldview, and it did not hinder their science one bit. So it is a battle of worldviews. It's not faith versus science. And intelligent design, biblical creation, it does require some faith, but it's not blind faith. We have evidence, and the evidence is before our eyes.
Yeah, that's a great answer. And of course, we know of many Christian scientists who are leaders in their fields today. Now I'm going to take a couple of questions that I've seen come in. I can see one from Lara Mua, who has asked, how far will mankind go with our technological advances? How far will mankind go with technological advances? Obviously, we've seen recently space explorations to Mars, NASA putting a number of rovers on Mars, things in artificial intelligence. Stuart, how far can all this go?
First of all, I think it's wonderful how we have such incredible technology. My friend Andy McIntosh is a recipient of great technology, fixing his heart, and in biomedical engineering, it's wonderful, the scanners we have, the MRI scanners and so on. And I think that's going to progress quite a lot. But we do see a lot of exaggeration. We're never going to make Mars habitable. There's a lot of exaggeration about that. There's a lot of exaggeration about how far robots can go, how much we can interface computers with humans. One of the reasons for that exaggeration is people get a lot of funding, a lot of grants if you make these wacky claims, but I think those things are not very helpful. It's not helpful to think that we could emigrate to Mars, or we might be able to put a computer chip in our head. I think there's a lot of fanciful thinking about a lot of those things.
Yeah, a lot of it actually probably comes from the influence of watching too much Star Trek or sci-fi things on TV rather than coming from real science. But there's another question come in, Stuart, from someone who's called themselves Creation Myth. So that's interesting. They've asked, do you completely reject that evolutionary, that question's gone down a bit, evolutionary processes are capable of generating novel biochemical cellular functional, or do you permit that can happen to some degree?
Okay, it's a very useful question, because there is some misunderstanding about, for example, adaptation. If I can just give the example of adaptation, creationists absolutely fully agree and see there is adaptation. For example, Darwin's finches, the beaks can adapt a lot, their feet, other parts of their body can adapt. So changes can happen a lot. We believe God has created that genetic potential for variation, for adaptation. But the key thing about Darwin's finches is they're always finches. They don't change into another kind of creature. There are limits to adaptation. A similar thing can happen on the biomolecular level. It's a design feature. In fact, engineers do this with cars. You build in adaptability and variability as a design feature. So, and it's a clever design feature, and it helps nature survive if things can change and adapt. The same is true of viruses. They can change and adapt. But the key is those changes are limited.
Yeah. There's one last question probably that we'll take from C. Bess, and it's what is your favorite example of biomimetics in the real world? So maybe they've just joined us, but what is your favorite example, Stuart, of biomimetics in the real world?
Yeah, my favorite example would be the one that I mentioned, the Wright brothers.
Yeah.
The first flying aeroplane is a wonderful story because the Wright brothers were bicycle designers. There was a huge, they were competing against huge companies, and they couldn't believe that these two bicycle designers got there first. And so it's a wonderful story. But the reason they got there first is because they studied creation. So the credit should go to the creator.
Yeah, amen, indeed. Well, Stuart, thank you so much for your time tonight. I know it's been a blessing to those that have been watching. I can see that from the comments in the chat section. And just a reminder to those that are watching, Professor Burgess, as well as 13 other speakers, I think 13 other speakers, will be joining us for an online mega conference in October. And if you click on the link that you can see now on the screen, that'll be in the comment section. That'll take you to the conference where you can sign up and register. I think there is a slight fee with that, but it's going to be a great 3 days of talks on creation, science, and the evidence for God. So I'd encourage you to go to ukmega.org and sign up for that conference. And as I mentioned at the beginning, Professor Stuart Burgess's co-authored book with Professor Andy McIntosh, Wonders of Creation, Design in a Fallen World, is available at our Answers in Genesis store. So just go to answersingenesis.org, look at the store there, and you will find that book. I would recommend you get that for not only for yourself, but for members of your family or friends that really struggle with some of these questions that we've been talking about, because that will really help them with these things. So, Stuart, thanks again for being with us tonight.
Yeah, thanks. Good to be with you.
And thank you, everyone, for watching. So I'm going to say good night because it's night time for me, or wherever you are in the world. I hope you have a great rest of the day. Good bus.